In the harsh glare of the political spotlight, words become weapons that cut in unexpected ways. As Minnesota Governor Tim Walz stands at the microphone, criticizing old white guys who disappoint us, few notice the irony hanging in the air. He's describing the very demographic he belongs to. Behind closed doors, campaign strategists calculate the damage as his comments about Tesla stock ripple through pension funds holding millions of shares, while his candid admission about his teenage son exposes the fragile line between public persona and private reality. What happens when authentic expression collides with political calculation, when personal feuds with billionaires affect everyday Americans' retirement accounts? Subscribe now to Karoline Now for the untold story of how one politician's unguarded moments reveal the deepening fault lines in American politics and what it means for all of us. The late afternoon light slanted through tall windows, casting long shadows across the crowd as Minnesota Governor Tim Walz leaned into the microphone. Something in his posture suggested a man who believed in the righteousness of his position, even as he waded into treacherous political waters. "I just pause for a moment and look around," Walz said, his voice carrying across the suddenly attentive room. "And look it, I'm especially talking about these old white guys who seem to disappoint us on a regular basis in this country." The words hung in the air like smoke. A curious silence followed, not of shock or outrage, but of calculation. In that moment of suspended judgment, the contradictions of Walz's position became apparent. Here stood a man who, by any objective measure, belonged to the very demographic he criticized. An older white male seeking one of the highest offices in America, yet positioning himself as somehow separate from it. Across the room, faces registered confusion. The crowd itself became a silent rebuke to Walz's rhetoric. Diverse in some ways, yes, but hardly aligned with the imagined audience his words seemed crafted to address. Political handlers exchanged glances in the wings, their expressions unreadable as stone. Beyond the immediate room, political fault lines deepened. In bars and living rooms across Minnesota and beyond, men who might once have related to Walz's plain-spoken Midwestern persona now found themselves cast as villains in his narrative. The strategy was as transparent as it was risky, sacrificing potential allies for the appearance of enlightenment. In Washington boardrooms and strategy sessions, analysts added this moment to growing files documenting the vice presidential candidate's approach. Some nodded in approval at his willingness to challenge traditional power structures. Others noted with concern the self-flagellation inherent in his remarks. What none could deny was the calculation behind it all, the careful threading of identity politics through campaign messaging like wire through clay, sometimes strengthening the structure, sometimes threatening to cut it apart from within. In Walz's words lay the central tension of modern American political discourse: how to acknowledge systemic privilege without alienating those who must be allies in changing it. As Walz continued his speech, moving to safer ground, the moment had already been captured, time-stamped, and sent racing through the digital landscape. Another brick laid in the wall of division, another test of whether Americans could see themselves in those who seek to lead them. The unexpected revelation came during a routine campaign stop, when Tim Walz, perhaps seeking to humanize himself through vulnerability, shared what many families might consider private terrain. The fluorescent lights of the community center buzzed overhead as Walz leaned into a story about his 18-year-old son with a casualness that belied its political implications. "I was trying to discipline Gus," Walz told the room, his voice carrying the familiar timbre of a father recounting teenage rebellion. But what followed was anything but familiar campaign fare. And he looked at me and said, "Says the guy who got his ass kicked by Donald Trump." A ripple moved through the audience, uncertain laughter, exchanged glances. In that unguarded moment, something profound had shifted in Walz's narrative. Just weeks earlier, cameras had captured Gus Walz at the Democratic National Convention, his young face wet with tears as his father accepted the vice presidential nomination. That tableau of familial pride had circulated widely, a perfect visual counterpoint to Republican messaging. Now, with a single anecdote, Walz had complicated that image himself. Across the digital landscape, the story metastasized almost instantly. Conservative commentators who had long positioned themselves as defenders of traditional family structures seized upon it as evidence of something broken, not just in the Walz household, but in the progressive vision of America they represented. "What kind of respect does a son have for a father he can mock so casually?" one Fox News host demanded that evening. the question hanging in the air like an indictment. Yet beneath the predictable partisan reaction lay a more nuanced American reality. In coffee shops and carpools, parents exchanged knowing glances. Teenagers had always wielded words like weapons, had always found the soft underbelly of parental authority. Was there something almost refreshing about a politician acknowledging the messy truth of family life? For Walz's campaign strategists, huddled in their hotel war room that night, the calculus was more complex. The candidate had succeeded in appearing authentic, that most coveted of political attributes, but at what cost? Polling data suggested they already faced challenges with male voters over 50, particularly in Rust Belt regions, where patriarchal family structures remained the unstated ideal. Would those men see in Walz's story a reflection of their own struggles with evolving masculinity, or merely evidence of weakness? Outside, autumn darkness gathered over America's fractured landscape. In this election cycle, even family dynamics couldn't escape the gravitational pull of political division. The most private moments, a father disciplining his son, a son's tearful pride, had become public currency, their value determined not by their human truth, but by their utility in the endless campaign to define what America was and what it should become. The morning light slanted through the windows of the MSNBC studio as Governor Tim Walz leaned forward in his chair, his face set with the same determined expression he'd worn when discussing his son's rebellious comment just days before. But today, his target wasn't the complexities of parenthood, it was the mythology of American business success personified in his opponent. I think the biggest myth perpetuated on this country is that Donald Trump understands anything about business, Walz stated, his voice carrying the flat certainty of the Midwest rather than the performative outrage so common in political discourse. He's bankrupt every single one he's been into, and now he's bankrupting this country. The words hung in the air, unadorned, yet pointed, another fault line opening in America's ongoing struggle to define itself through its economic values. For generations, the nation had mythologized business acumen, elevating CEOs to folk heroes even as it quietly buried their failures beneath narratives of resilience. Now Walz was challenging not just Trump, but that entire cultural framework. Trump is stuck in the 80s. His music, his clothing, his thinking, the governor continued, his tone suggesting something between pity and disdain. He has been on this tariff thing forever, and every economist, conservative or liberal, will tell you they just simply don't work. Across America, in diners and car factories, on family farms, and in suburban offices, the words resonated differently depending on who heard them. To some, they cut through decades of carefully cultivated business celebrity, exposing the hollow center of a gilded reputation. To others, they seemed to attack something sacred, the American permission to fail, to rise, to reimagine oneself unlimited by past mistakes. By evening, conservative commentators who had previously seized upon Walz's parenting anecdote now found fresh ammunition. First he mocks traditional family authority, one talk show host intoned gravely, and now he mocks the entrepreneurial spirit that built this nation. The framing was deliberate, positioning Walz's comments as an attack not on one man's business record, but on the aspirational cornerstone of American identity itself. Inside Democratic strategy rooms, aides exchanged glances. Their internal polling showed voters increasingly skeptical of Trump's business credentials, yet simultaneously protective of the broader ideal of American entrepreneurship. The line between criticizing a man and appearing to criticize a cherished national mythology was vanishingly thin. Had Walz crossed it? As darkness fell over the heartland, the day's comments joined countless others in the swirling digital ecosystem of American political discourse. But beneath the partisan noise lay a deeper question, unasked and unanswered. In a nation that had elevated business success to a moral virtue, what did it mean when that success proved more performance than reality? And what did it reveal about America that so many remained invested in the performance, despite mounting evidence of its hollowness? The video clip spread through digital America like wildfire through drought-parched plains. There stood Tim Walz, grinning broadly at a campaign event, his voice carrying that distinctive Midwestern cadence as he held up his phone with theatrical flourish. On the iPhone, they've got that little stock app, he told the crowd, eyes crinkling at the corners with unmistakable satisfaction. I added Tesla to it to give me a little boost during the day, $225 and dropping. The audience laughed, a sound that would echo far beyond that room as the footage raced across social media platforms. Walz wasn't finished, suggesting Tesla owners could, quote, take dental floss and pull the Tesla thing off their vehicles, his joke landing with his supporters but landing far differently elsewhere in America's fractured landscape. In Minnesota's state pension offices, the irony lay buried in spreadsheets and financial disclosures. The state's retirement portfolio held approximately 1.66 million shares of the very company whose stock decline their governor celebrated. Hundreds of millions of dollars of teachers and state workers' retirement funds tied to the electric vehicle manufacturer, the same company whose falling fortune Walz had turned into a punchline. Business commentators seized upon the contradiction. Their monitors displayed split screens. On one side, Walz's gleeful commentary, on the other, graphs of Minnesota's pension fund holdings. The narrative was writing itself, a candidate who appeared to celebrate the financial diminishment of his own constituents' retirement security. The moment represented something deeper than mere political gaffe. It exposed the growing intersection of personal animus and governance, where the complex machinery of public finance collided with the raw emotions of America's ongoing culture wars. For some voters, Walz's comments merely confirmed their suspicion that his judgment had become clouded by partisan feeling, that his disdain for Musk had overwhelmed his responsibility to those whose financial security partly depended on Tesla's success. As evening news programs dissected the controversy, ordinary Americans watching from their living rooms were left to ponder a distinctly modern question. In a nation where business, politics, and personal identity had become so thoroughly entangled, what happened when public officials allowed personal rivalries to influence their perception of economic reality? And what did it mean for governance when the line between political opponent and economic stakeholder blurred beyond recognition? The light from screens illuminating countless American faces carried not just Walz's words, but the reflection of a country still struggling to reconcile its economic interests with its deepening tribal instincts, a tension that would remain long after this particular controversy faded from headlines. The studio lights cast a harsh truth on Tim Walz's face as he settled into the MSNBC interview chair. What had begun as political positioning was now laid bare under the unforgiving gaze of national media scrutiny, where every micro-expression would be dissected by millions. It's not personal with him, Walz began, his voice steady but his eyes betraying something deeper. A brief pause followed, that momentary hesitation where truth wrestles with calculation. It's a little bit personal. I don't want to be disingenuous, the guy does bother me. The words hung in the air, not merely as political commentary, but as a rare moment of unvarnished personal admission. America, watching through the sterile medium of television screens, witnessed something increasingly uncommon in the choreographed dance of modern politics: authentic dislike, undisguised and unfiltered. Walz's shoulders tensed slightly as he pivoted to broader terrain. My mom's Social Security check this month is late, he offered, attempting to transform personal antagonism into policy critique. The connection between Musk and delayed government benefits remained tenuous, yet in Walz's narrative, they were branches of the same tree, symbols of a system where billionaires crying about their portfolio occupied space that rightfully belonged to ordinary Americans' concerns. Across the nation, in quiet rooms where political strategists gathered around conference tables littered with polling data and coffee cups, the calculus began. Some nodded appreciatively. This was language that might resonate with voters harboring their own suspicions about wealth and power. Others winced, seeing in Walz's candor a potential vulnerability, a crack in the veneer of statesmanship that opponents might exploit. What none could deny was how thoroughly the exchange captured America's evolving political reality. Policy papers and position statements now competed with the raw theater of personal animosity. The complex machinery of governance increasingly filtered through the lens of individual relationships, feuds conducted in public view, rivalries that colored how leaders perceived both problems and solutions. In living rooms and on commuter trains, on factory floors and in office break rooms, Americans processed this moment not merely as political theater, but as reflection. The blurred boundaries between personal feeling and public responsibility mirrored their own struggles to separate emotional response from rational assessment in an era where the personal and political had become inextricably entangled. As night fell across America, the interview faded from screens but not from the national consciousness. In its place lingered a question that extended far beyond Walz and Musk, beyond pension funds and stock prices. to the very heart of how a divided nation would govern itself. Could a country navigate its most pressing challenges when personal antipathy had become so central to its political vocabulary? The answer remained unwritten, a chapter still being composed in real time by millions of hands. Beyond the immediate fallout of Walz's candid remarks lay a more profound national reckoning, one that political strategists across America now contemplated in wood-paneled war rooms as they studied demographic maps like generals surveying contested terrain. The controversies surrounding the candidate had inadvertently illuminated fracture lines running deep beneath the Democratic Party's foundation. In Michigan diners and Pennsylvania machine shops, men with calloused hands and fading union loyalties exchanged glances when Walz's comments about old white guys played on mounted television screens. These were the very voters whose gradual drift from the Democratic coalition had redrawn America's electoral map. Their absence felt like phantom limbs by a party that once counted them as its backbone. "What we're witnessing," observed a veteran campaign strategist who requested anonymity to speak freely, "is the collision between authentic self-expression and the calculated requirements of modern messaging." His fingers tapped nervously against a conference table, cluttered with polling crosstabs showing troubling trends among working-class men. The numbers told a story that transcended Walz's individual missteps. Political communication had always demanded strength, competence, and relatability. Qualities that withered under the heat of self-deprecation transformed into what some voters perceived as self-loathing. The line between refreshing candor and alienating rhetoric had grown vanishingly thin in the age of perpetual outrage. Outside party headquarters, autumn leaves scattered across concrete as younger staffers huddled in tight circles, their breath visible in the cooling air. The authenticity paradox, one communications director called it, the public's simultaneous demand for unscripted humanity and polished perfection from their leaders. The impossible standard that turned genuine moments into political liabilities faster than a video could be edited for social media consumption. Across town, Republican strategists archived these moments with methodical precision, not merely as individual errors, but as evidence supporting a broader narrative about Democrats' struggle to speak convincingly across demographic divides. The incidents accumulated like individual pixels, forming a larger image, one of a party caught between competing impulses, between honoring its diverse coalition and recapturing the voters who had once been its standard-bearers. As evening descended on the Capitol, the controversy faded from chyrons, but not from the collective political consciousness. The questions it raised lingered in the spaces between campaign stops and strategy sessions. Could a party reconnect with demographics it had struggled to retain while remaining true to its evolving identity? Could authentic expression coexist with effective political communication? And beneath it all ran a current that neither party had fully reckoned with: the growing inability of American political discourse to hold complexity without reducing it to simple antagonisms. The sun set on another day of campaigning, but these questions remained, suspended in the national conversation, like particles that refused to settle, waiting for answers that transcended any single candidate or controversy. The collision between political rhetoric and economic reality echoed through marble corridors of power and across factory floors with equal resonance. What began as a moment of candor from Tim Walz had evolved into something more profound, a case study in the delicate dance between elected officials and the corporate forces that shaped American communities. In wood-paneled university offices, political economists traced historical patterns with weathered fingers. "Politicians criticizing major employers has always been a high-wire act without a safety net," remarked Professor Eleanor Harmon, her voice carrying the weight of decades studying such relationships. Behind her, bookshelves sagged with volumes chronicling similar tensions throughout American history. Tesla's manufacturing campuses stood as monuments to contradiction, sleek symbols of green innovation built by a company led by someone who had become anathema to many Democratic leaders. Workers in blue coveralls moved between assembly stations, their mortgages, health insurance, and children's college funds, invisibly tethered to political calculations happening thousands of miles away. "We're witnessing the collision of personal animosity and economic pragmatism," observed Raymond Mercer, a veteran of 3 presidential administrations, watching the controversy unfold on multiple screens in his consulting firm's Situation Room. History suggests this rarely ends well for the politicians involved. In state capitals, the ripple effects move beneath the surface of public discourse. Economic development directors exchanged worried glances during budget meetings, their unspoken concern hanging in fluorescent-lit conference rooms. Would their states be next to face corporate reconsideration if their governors entered similar rhetorical territories? Precedent whispered warnings from the past. Folders in government archives held post-mortems of previous feuds between elected officials and corporate leaders, tax revenues that evaporated, ribbon cuttings that happened across state lines, campaign promises that withered against the hard reality of capital flight. At the intersection of Silicon Valley and Wall Street, a new power dynamic had emerged that political playbooks hadn't fully accounted for. Tech executives commanded audiences that rivaled those of senators and governors, their platforms unrestricted by electoral cycles or geographic boundaries. Their decisions about where to build, whom to hire, and how to deploy resources could reshape communities faster than any legislation. The fundamental question, said Catherine Yuen, addressing students at a public policy seminar as autumn light streamed through tall windows, is whether our democratic institutions have adapted to a world where corporate leaders wield influence comparable to elected officials, while answering to shareholders rather than voters. As twilight settled over the nation, millions of Americans checked retirement accounts where Tesla stock might reside, drove home in vehicles bearing its emblem, or passed billboards advertising its vision of the future. The controversy had revealed something essential about modern America, a complex ecosystem where political principles, economic necessities, and personal ambitions formed an uneasy alliance that no single perspective could fully capture. The clash over Trump's business record unfolded against the backdrop of a nation still wrestling with its own economic mythology. Tim Walz's pointed critique of the former president's corporate history, casting it as a series of bankruptcies that foreshadowed national decline, had touched the raw nerve of America's conflicted relationship with failure itself. In this country, we've built statues to men who failed 1,000 times before succeeding once, remarked economist Daniel Forrester, his office walls adorned with portraits of Edison, Ford, and Carnegie, men whose paths to legend were paved with spectacular miscalculations. Morning light caught the dust particles floating around him, illuminating the question hanging in the air: was failure the seedbed of innovation, or evidence of fundamental incompetence? The rhetoric flowing from both sides revealed more than mere campaign positioning. It exposed the fault lines between two Americas with fundamentally different relationships to risk and reward. In union halls with faded photographs of labor struggles, progressive organizers spoke of Trump's business failures as betrayals, moments when workers bore the consequences while the executive walked away unscathed. In entrepreneurial incubators, with exposed brick and salvaged wood tables, conservative business mentors pointed to those same failures as evidence of the creative destruction essential to market evolution. We're not just arguing about one man's balance sheet, noted Dr. Elaine Winters, her voice carrying through a lecture hall where students furiously captured her words. We're debating whether America should protect its citizens from economic harm or push them toward the discomfort that sometimes breeds innovation. Behind closed doors in policy institutes, analysts with rolled sleeves traced how these philosophical differences manifested in concrete proposals: progressive calls for stronger bankruptcy protections for workers versus conservative pushes to streamline regulations that might impede business pivots. The debate transcended Trump himself, becoming a referendum on national character. In community colleges where middle-aged students sought second chances, in venture capital firms where partners evaluated risk tolerances, the same question emerged in different forms: should America embrace those who had never fallen, or those who had fallen and risen again? The question lingered in the silence between campaign speeches, in the margins of economic policy papers, in the hushed conversations of voters trying to reconcile their personal experiences with competing national narratives. Perhaps, suggested retired history teacher Margaret Hayes, watching the debate play out on her television in a Pittsburgh suburb, we've never really decided what success means in this country. The evening news continued, but her words hung in the air, a simple observation that cut to the heart of America's ongoing struggle to define itself through the stories it tells about money, merit, and the messy business of building both fortunes and nations. In the glare of public scrutiny, the private tensions of political families cast long shadows across America's divided landscape. Tim Walz's unexpected revelation about disciplining his teenage son had traveled from a casual campaign anecdote to the center of a cultural maelstrom, a microcosm of the nation's struggle to define the boundaries between public obligation and private sanctuary. Family has always been our most potent political currency, observed Dr. Mariana Crest, her office walls lined with photographs documenting presidential family imagery across decades. We demand perfection while knowing it's impossible. The afternoon light caught the edge of a Nixon family portrait beside a Clinton Christmas card. Different eras, identical performances of familial harmony. What made the Walz disclosure remarkable wasn't the content. Parents and teenagers have clashed since time immemorial, but the voluntary nature of the revelation. Where previous generations of political operatives had labored to construct impenetrable walls between a candidate's family life and public persona, Walz had casually dismantled that barrier himself, inviting millions into a moment of parental frustration that would normally play out behind closed doors. In suburban living rooms and urban apartments across Minnesota, parents of teenagers recognized the universal rhythm of the exchange, the boundary testing, the correction, the tension between developing independence and parental authority. But filtered through partisan lenses, this unremarkable family moment transformed into something else entirely. The same interaction was read as either refreshing authenticity or troubling indiscretion depending on one's political alignment. We're watching the weaponization of the ordinary, noted family psychologist Dr. Raymond Mercer, his voice steady as he considered the implications. When normal developmental friction involves public figures, it becomes laden with symbolic weight it was never meant to bear. The contrast between Gus Walz's visible emotion during his father's convention moment and the later disciplinary exchange created a portrait of family complexity that defied the sanitized narratives typically constructed for political consumption. In living rooms across America, voters weren't just evaluating a policy position or campaign promise, but something more visceral, their own comfort with authentic family dynamics playing out on a national stage. As evening fell on campaign offices in swing states, strategists pored over focus group data measuring reactions to the revelation. The numbers revealed a pattern that transcended party lines. Americans simultaneously demanded authenticity from their leaders while punishing them for human imperfection. It was a contradiction embedded in the national character, as American as apple pie and impossible standards. Perhaps, suggested veteran political journalist Eleanor Mathis, watching the controversy unfold from her Washington office, what we're really seeing is America's ambivalence about vulnerability itself. Outside her window, monuments to seemingly infallible historical figures stood in stark contrast to the messy, complicated humanity playing out in the current campaign. A testament to the gap between the leaders we mythologize and the flawed humans we actually elect. The handshake that never happened between Governor Walz and Elon Musk lingered in the air like a ghost, invisible yet undeniably present in the theater of American politics. "I don't like the guy," Walz had stated with a bluntness that would have shocked previous generations of politicians trained to veil personal antipathies behind diplomatic platitudes. The words hung raw and unadorned in the autumn air, remarkable not for their sentiment, but for their naked admission of something politicians once guarded carefully: personal dislike. Across America, citizens nodded in silent recognition. They too had formed visceral opinions about public figures they'd never met, their living rooms long transformed into judgment chambers where personal likability had become inextricably tangled with policy positions. The Walz-Musk tension was merely the visible tip of a vast iceberg of personalized politics that now defined the national conversation. "We're witnessing the culmination of a decades-long shift," observed Dr. Eleanor Winters, her office walls lined with election artifacts spanning 50 years of increasingly personal campaigns. Policy disagreements that once remained clinical have transformed into character assessments. Behind her desk, a social media dashboard displayed real-time exchanges between elected officials and business leaders. Confrontational, immediate, often laced with thinly veiled contempt. In government buildings across Washington, the practical consequences of these personal animosities played out in subtle ways. Meetings that should have focused on infrastructure innovations devolved into status competitions. Public-private partnerships that might have benefited communities withered in the toxic soil of personal grievances. The machinery of governance, designed to function regardless of individual feelings, instead ground against the grit of human antipathy. Journalists amplified these dynamics, their coverage drawn irresistibly to the human drama of personal conflict, rather than the dry complexities of policy detail. In editing rooms, decisions were made daily to foreground personality clashes over substantive disagreement, not from malice but from the simple truth that conflict attracts eyes, and eyes attract revenue. As twilight settled over campaign headquarters in swing states, Strategists pored over polling data that revealed an uncomfortable truth. Voters responded more viscerally to knowing whom a candidate disliked than understanding what they proposed. Some campaign veterans embraced this reality, deliberately stoking the fires of personalized politics. Others mourned what had been lost, the fading possibility of principled disagreement without personal condemnation. Perhaps, suggested veteran political scientist Dr. Samuel Harmon, watching the controversy unfold with the weary eyes of someone who had witnessed too many democratic norms erode, what we're witnessing is the natural evolution of a system that was always more human than its architects acknowledged. Outside his window, the Capitol dome glowed in the distance, its perfect symmetry belying the messy, complicated emotions churning within its walls, a testament to the gap between the idealized function of democracy and its all-too-human operation. The words "old white guys" hung in the air like smoke after a skirmish, another verbal grenade in America's endless culture war. Tim Walz's offhand comment had exposed the hairline fractures in the Democratic coalition, fractures that party strategists privately acknowledged had been widening for years beneath a veneer of unity. In campaign war rooms across the country, analysts pored over demographic charts with the intensity of battlefield commanders, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of screens displaying an electorate increasingly resistant to neat categorization. "We're trying to speak to voters who no longer listen to each other," confided a veteran Democratic consultant, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who had watched communication channels collapse in real time. "Our messages ricochet around echo chambers without ever reaching their intended targets." Behind her, muted television screens displayed focus group footage. Working-class men in Michigan shaking their heads at phrases crafted in Washington conference rooms. The polling data told a story that party leaders were reluctant to fully acknowledge. Support among male voters had eroded like a shoreline during storm season, gradual then suddenly catastrophic. What had once been mild skepticism had hardened into entrenched opposition. The charts revealed a particularly troubling trend line among the very demographics the Democrats had once counted as the backbone of their coalition. "Authenticity isn't manufactured," observed Dr. Marion Keyes, watching politicians attempt the impossible alchemy of appealing simultaneously to progressive activists and moderate swing voters. When candidates contort themselves into unrecognizable shapes, voters sense the artifice. In focus group centers across America, ordinary citizens displayed an almost preternatural ability to detect calculation behind political messaging, their instincts honed by decades of exposure to increasingly sophisticated marketing. Campaign veterans recalled simpler times when political communication followed more predictable patterns. "We used to build narratives that created bridges between different communities," remarked James Harmon, a silver-haired strategist who had advised presidents since the Reagan era. "Now we're navigating chasms that seem to widen with every news cycle." His office walls were lined with campaign memorabilia from an era when political differences, while significant, hadn't yet calcified into separate realities. As the controversy surrounding Walz's comments continued to reverberate through the political ecosystem, strategists faced the central paradox of contemporary political communication: how to craft messages authentic enough to establish credibility, yet flexible enough to appeal across America's cultural divides. The challenge wasn't merely tactical but existential, a reflection of a nation struggling to maintain coherent conversation with itself while speaking increasingly different languages. The collision of politics and finance played out silently on computer screens across Minnesota, where pension fund managers tracked the ripple effects of their governor's words. Tim Walz's criticism of Tesla had entered the bloodstream of the markets, an invisible current affecting retirement accounts that belonged to the very citizens who had elected him. In the cool, blue light of investment offices, the contradiction was laid bare. State funds invested heavily in companies whose leaders the state's highest official publicly condemned. Money and morality had always maintained an uneasy alliance in American politics. But in boardrooms where Minnesota's pension portfolio managers worked, the mathematics of financial responsibility couldn't accommodate the luxury of political theater. They moved funds with the dispassionate precision of surgeons, their responsibilities to teachers, firefighters, and civil servants transcending the day's political skirmishes. "The fiduciary obligation doesn't recognize party lines," explained Dr. Eleanor Ramsey, a public finance expert whose glasses reflected spreadsheets filled with the future security of thousands. When officials criticize companies they're simultaneously invested in, they're navigating a minefield few voters fully comprehend. Behind closed doors, Economic advisors to elected officials exchanged knowing glances when political rhetoric threatened financial stability. They understood the unspoken calculus that statements made for immediate political advantage could extract long-term economic costs from the very constituents they were meant to champion. On Wall Street, analysts noted the growing phenomenon with clinical detachment. "We now factor political volatility into price targets," said Marcus Chen, whose investment recommendations affected billions in capital flows. "When governors or senators speak about publicly traded companies, markets react before the sound bites finish playing on evening news." In the measured tones of governance experts, concern was rising about the transparency gap, the space between what officials said to microphones and the financial dependencies linking their constituents to the very targets of their criticism. Helena Washington, who had advised 3 administrations on ethics, placed her fountain pen deliberately on a stack of governance guidelines. "Democracy requires voters to understand the full consequences of political theater," she said, including how it might affect their retirement accounts. The morning after Walz's comments, pension managers across Minnesota made minor adjustments to portfolios worth billions, quietly balancing their governor's words against their oath to protect beneficiaries' interests. Another quiet compromise in a nation struggling to reconcile its political passions with its economic realities. Americans now inhabited separate realities, their perceptions divided not by geography but by the glowing screens they consulted each morning. In the fractured landscape of modern media, the same events unfolded as entirely different stories depending on which channel you watched, which feed you scrolled, which podcasts filled your commute. Tim Walz's comments about Tesla existed simultaneously as righteous challenge and reckless attack, depending on where one stood in the national divide. "We're witnessing reality itself becoming partisan," observed Dr. Samira Khoury, her office walls lined with decades of media research as she traced the diverging narratives with her finger across multiple monitors. For one viewer, Walz stands against corporate excess. For another, he's undermining American innovation. There is no longer a shared understanding of what happened, only competing interpretations. The machinery of modern information consumption hummed invisibly around these conflicts. In darkened server farms across the country, algorithms processed billions of interactions, learning with each click and share which content triggered the strongest emotions, which headlines kept eyes glued to screens. These systems, built to maximize engagement rather than understanding, amplified division with cold efficiency. On living room couches and subway commutes across Minnesota, citizens absorbed entirely different versions of their governor's story, without ever crossing paths with alternative interpretations. The architecture of digital media had constructed invisible walls between neighbors, each conviction reinforced by a carefully curated stream of confirming evidence. "The challenge for someone like Walz isn't just communicating effectively," explained Raymond Torres, whose decades studying political messaging had left deep lines around thoughtful eyes. "It's penetrating ecosystems designed to reject information that contradicts their internal logic." He gestured toward a wall of screens displaying the same story transformed through different media filters. Once a narrative takes hold in these separate worlds, facts alone rarely dislodge it. In newsrooms and campaign communication centers, the professionals tasked with bridging these divides worked with increasingly complicated maps of American perception. They charted how a single statement would ricochet differently through distinct information environments, knowing that correction would always travel more slowly than accusation. Meanwhile, fact-checkers labored in the shadows of viral content, their methodical work often reaching audiences long after minds had been made up. Their careful annotations accumulated in digital archives, while emotional narratives raced ahead, unencumbered by the weight of verification. As darkness fell across the state, Minnesotans retired to their homes, each carrying their own version of the day's events, the same words transformed into different truths, the same leader rendered as either villain or champion. The national conversation continued in fragmentary form, a broken mirror reflecting not one America but many. Power no longer resided solely in marble buildings or wood-paneled offices. It now flowed through fiber-optic cables and lived in the digital devotion of millions. As Tim Walz's comments about Trump and Musk reverberated across America's fractured information landscape, the nation witnessed something more profound than mere political skirmish. It was watching the quiet redistribution of American influence itself. In a downtown Chicago conference room, Professor Eleanor Reeves traced decades of business-government relations across a whiteboard, filled with shifting power structures. "We're seeing the culmination of a transformation," she explained, her voice carrying the weight of historical perspective. CEOs once pulled strings behind closed doors. Now they're center stage, wielding followers instead of just capital. Elon Musk represented something American politics hadn't fully reckoned with, a figure whose personal following transcended both corporate position and partisan identity. Each morning, more Americans consumed his thoughts directly than read many major newspapers. His digital pronouncements carried an immediacy that bypassed traditional gatekeepers, landing unfiltered in the palms of millions. The authority equation has fundamentally changed, noted veteran campaign strategist Marcus Denton, gazing through office windows at the Washington Monument in the distance. When you attack someone with 20 million devoted followers, you're not just confronting a person, you're challenging a community who've invested personal identity in that figure. The calculus grew more complex when these business leaders controlled the very platforms where public discourse unfolded. Musk's acquisition of X had transformed him from mere participant to architect of the public square. Politicians now navigated terrain where criticizing platform owners meant risking their digital voice itself. Walz's comments had inadvertently illuminated this new reality. In coffee shops and campus quads, Americans debated not just the substance of his criticisms, but what right politicians had to challenge these new centers of power at all. Some saw democratic accountability asserting itself, others perceived government overreach into private enterprise. Behind closed doors, campaign strategists huddled over data showing follower overlap between business figures and voter blocs. They plotted approaches that might critique business practices without alienating admirers, searching for language that could bridge worlds increasingly separated by allegiance rather than argument. The sun set over an America where power no longer respected traditional boundaries. As citizens scrolled through their feeds, the question of who truly shaped their nation's direction, those they elected or those they followed, remained unanswered, hovering in the digital ether where so much of American life now unfolded. Markets had their own language, a dialect of confidence, hesitation, and cold calculation that responded to words as much as numbers. As the controversy over Walz's Tesla comments reverberated through political circles, a subtler conversation unfolded in the glass towers of financial districts across America. At the Chicago Board of Trade, veteran market analyst Sarah Brennan watched trading screens with practiced detachment. What politicians often miss, she observed, her voice barely audible above the electronic hum of capital in motion, is that markets don't hear ideology, they hear risk. Economic policy experts had long understood the delicate ecology of investor confidence. Official statements that might pass as routine campaign rhetoric in political realms translated differently when filtered through the algorithms and instincts governing trillion-dollar markets. Words that targeted specific companies carried weight beyond their intended political context. "There's a reason central bankers speak like they're diffusing bombs," remarked former Treasury advisor James Whitman, gazing across New York's financial district from a 37th floor conference room. When high office and economic signals mix, unintended consequences follow. The distinction wasn't abstract. In boardrooms from Boston to San Francisco, investment committees parsed political rhetoric for hints of regulatory hostility. They sought patterns that might predict which sectors could face increased scrutiny, or which companies might become examples in larger political narratives. These assessments translated directly into capital allocation, the invisible hand guided by perception as much as policy. A Maryland business confidence survey lay open on economist Maria Chen's desk at Brookings. She traced a finger along declining investment figures during periods of political unpredictability. Companies can adapt to almost any regulatory environment, she noted, but they freeze when they can't predict what's coming next. This reality created a governance paradox that few in political life had successfully navigated. Legitimate criticism of corporate practices served essential democratic functions, yet personalizing these critiques introduced market uncertainty that could undermine broader economic goals. The line between accountability and antagonism blurred in a system where perception itself held economic value. As evening descended on Wall Street, traders closed positions and algorithms completed their final calculations. Tomorrow would bring new data, new statements, new uncertainties. The markets would respond not just to what was said, but to what might be meant, translating the language of political conflict into the cold mathematics of risk assessment. In this quiet transformation of words into economic reality, America's divided politics found yet another way to shape its uncertain future.